Very good evening and warm welcome to all of you. This is the third edition of Reading Hub. The first one was The Journey of Civilization. Second one was Home in the World. Nobel laureate Muthaiah's book was reviewed by Panneerselvan. Now this is the third edition. On behalf of Roja Muthaiah Research Library and the Dravidian Professionals Forum, I warmly welcome all of you. But I would like to invite Mr. Pugar Gandhi, who is the executive coordinator for the Reading Hub, to come and officially invite all of you and introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Mr. Subramanian. Welcome to the third edition of the Reading Hub about the joint venture between Dravidian Professional Forum and Roja Muthaiah Research Library. As our founder always says, ideas of the life of any moment. With this, we started this think tank Dravidian Professionals Forum to create content. Over the journey, we also formed this joint venture between Dravidian Professionals Forum and Roja Muthaiah Research Library to bring back the culture of book reading, which many of us have forgotten because of the fast-moving pace of social media. Today's book gains importance in this contemporary world, which is Interrogating Numbers, Whole Numbers and Half Truth by senior journalist Ms. S. Rukmini. It talks about the importance of data and data management and data mining in decision making and policy decisions. Yesterday, I just want to share my experience. Yesterday, I was arguing a sensitive case in Madurai High Court, which is the sedition case slapped against the YouTuber Maridas. Many of us know what is the reason behind that particular case, why the government slapped the sedition, and I was the arguing counsel for the DMK petitioner. On December 8th, on the accidental death of the Chief of Defense Staff, Mr. Maridas posted two tweets. One is, DK and DMK followers are staring at the death of the general and smiling or laughing. So DMK is promoting successionist tendencies. This is the first tweet. The second tweet is, he travels a bit further and say the government is promoting this successionism. So the state was quick enough to slap sedition under section 144A and 153A. The honorable judge was a bit confused or maybe a bit not in favor, saying that this is just a normal tweet. Why should this be treated under 124A or 153A? Because this tweet means nothing. It may be a casual tweet of Maridas, without reading into without in detail reading into the intention of the tweet. So we have to explain how this particular tweet constitutes an offense under 124A or 153A. The tweet says, the DMK and DK followers were celebrating and staring at the death of the General Bipin Rawat. It drew parallels to the movie Troy, where Achilles, when he saw his girlfriend was captured by the king Agamemnon, removes his sword from the sheath with a vengeance and tells the king Agamemnon, before I am done, I will look down to your corpse and smile. This is the most vengeful statement one can make. And this is what Maridas has intended in this speech, the most vengeful statement one can make, which will lead to the disruption of harmony, which will lead to the disruption of communal balance. However, the court was harping upon the personal liberty under Article 19.1a. Article 19.1a guarantees fundamental right under for freedom of speech and expression. The court was mainly concerned about the personal liberty, but Article 19(1)(a) talks about freedom of speech and expression, which can be restricted by Article 19(2) by reasonable restrictions. In any that is what we call it as collective liberty. In any society commanded by rule of law, there will always be a negotiation between a personal liberty and a collective liberty. And it is the state which has to protect both the personal liberty and the collective liberty by striking a balance between the two. And the courts are the final arbitrators whether the state has taken a right measure or not. For example, this Article 19(1)(a) can be traced back to the issue of haves and have-nots, why this was framed in the first place. In those days, the society, not only those days, the society was divided into haves and have-nots. That is the difference between economical imbalance and other social divide. The haves always forms the ruling community or the cronies or rulers who frames the rules and regulations, against which the have-nots have to raise their voice. So in order to give sanctity to the voice of the have-nots, this particular provision has been incorporated in the Constitution. But this particular provision has underwent a paradigm shift from, it is incorporated, I'm only talking about the Indian context, from 1950s or 1947 to 2021 on two accounts. One is the cronies themselves, over a period of time, the cronies themselves, through their agents, started dominating the space in Article 19(1)(a). Instead of the have-nots raising their voice under Article 19(1)(a), cronies put their agents and raise their voice as against the state decisions. Thus, the agents of cronies becomes an influencers. So the courts have to raise the wheel and see whether the person who is raising the voice is really a have-not or he's an agent of the crony. He's acting with such an intention. The second one is the advent of technology. In 1950s, when we talk about Article 19(1)(a), that is freedom of speech and expression, the communication channels are very less. For example, when in the yesteryears, the leaders like Annadurai or Periyar or maybe the Rajaji or whoever be the leaders, when they addressed an event, the communication channels were limited with respect to that particular village or commune or maybe a street play or a street drama. So from Chennai, when those leaders spoke at that point of time, the message from the originator to the recipient, say for example in Kanyakumari, it will take at least 10 to 15 days to reach. And that too, it will reach through human messages. The person who would have attended the meeting would have gone to, then he will go to Trichy. From Trichy, it will pass on to another person in Madurai, and Madurai to Kanyakumari. So the message from the originator to the recipient will undergo multiple level of scrutiny by human beings. So Article 19(1)(a) at that point of time has got a higher sanctity, whereas this went into a paradigm shift with the advent of technology. Later it became, with the advent of technology, later it became newspapers, radios, AM and FM, then satellite channels. And at the end of, say for example, the first decade of 2000, we also had endless number of this 24/7 news channels, which disseminates the data in real time. And this is much worse in the current scenario, that is in the social media channel, where the data is disseminated from the originator to the recipient on real-time terms, that is without any intermediary scrutiny between the originator and the recipient. Therefore, the veracity of the data cannot be determined initially. That leads to the communal disharmony. So when the courts interpret the provision of Article 19(1)(a), which no courts in this country have done or even internationally have been done, the impact of the technology on 19(1)(a) has to be taken into consideration before passing a judgment. This was our argument. Though the judge passionately heard the matter, ultimately the judge dismissed our plea and quashed the FIR against this YouTuber Maridas. Why I'm saying this particular book talks about, very lucidly talks about the importance of data in these particular sphere. How data can be used, whether the data can be excessive, whether there should be insufficient data, or there can be untrue, there is false data. All these things should be factored into a communication which will impact the constitutional rights and remedies. With this, I would like to welcome the author of this book, Ms. Rukmini, and the former chief economic advisor to Government of India, Arvind Subramanian, who has joined us from the United States. Through A.S. Panneerselvan, the curator of this program. Through Sundar, director of Roja Research Library. Professor Jayaranjan, who has joined us now, the vice chairman of the Planning Commission. Professor Vijay Bhaskar, member of the Planning Commission. Yesterday, I would also say, after reading this book, if this book had been published much earlier, maybe yesterday's judgment would have been different. Thank you.
No, we are here. Welcome, Rukmini. Floor is yours. We would like you to first explain why you decided to write a book on data. And second is, what are the challenges you face as a data journalist? And then we can request Professor Subramanian to join.
This is on. And I'm just making sure that the camera is here so I can wave to Professor Subramanian here.
Yeah, please.
He can see us from here.
Yes.
Right? So I'd like to start by thanking all of you for coming here. Journalism relies on generosity, and one great example of generosity has been Professor Subramanian, not just with his time today, but I would say with his insights over the last few months that I've interacted with him. There are many others here whose generosity with their expertise and time like to thank for. I don't hold views on everything. I certainly hold, limited views on many political issues, and I am going to stick to what's in the book. But since connection has been made with this case and the book, I would like to start by saying that one of the things that the book seeks to do is to push back against strongly held narratives, whether on any side of the aisle. And for me, this has meant personally examining my own biases as well, and making sure that they hold up against the ideals that I believe in. So one of the points that the book makes, which you'll see in chapter 2, for example, which talks about thoughts and beliefs, is about a rising trend of authoritarianism among younger people, and sort of problems with professed support of civil rights and the rule of law. So I would like to start by saying, not that my view has been sought on this, but I would like to start by saying that I personally do not support criminal action against people for tweets, even if they are abhorrent, except in some circumstances. So, of course, this is not, neither is my view being sought, nor is it necessary over here. But if a connection is being drawn, I would like to say that I resist, pushbacks against civil rights for everyone. And this is something that I talk about in the chapter on police, for example. I do not think that our lines in the sand should be drawn based on who the accused is. These are universal values, and I would like to say that, I subscribe to these universal values. Anyway, you have not come here for my views on politics or life. What I've done in this book is I have tried to distill about 10 or 15 years of reporting experience. The first 10 or so were as a field reporter who was sent across the length and breadth of the country to cover whatever was happening. I believe some of you here are journalism students, and the greatest education you can have is being sent to every distant corner of your city and of your country. I think what that experience did was to give me the tools to understand the data that came next. So when I see a spreadsheet or I see a data set, I can picture the people behind it. And what I've tried to do in this book is use a combination of the two to try and tell stories about modern India. Could I have the presentation up, please? The book tries to answer 10 big questions about how things work in modern India through a combination of what the data tells us, as well as what I feel the data either misses or gets wrong or is misleading on. Sorry, this is a little pixelated, so I'll just have to say that you'll have to pick up the book to see the contents page. I want to, the book is not only talking about issues of data integrity. Uh, it does try to tell you a little bit about the way things work in modern India, whether it's crime or whether it's income and consumption, whether it is caste, whether it is gender relations. But today's discussion, I'm going to keep it to the issue of data integrity. And on this topic, I have 3 or 4 sort of broad points that I'd like to make today. One of the things that I find maybe not enough feel is a feeling of humbling in the face of Indian data. And I definitely had this experience while working on this book, which is that the edifice of data that has been created in this country is vast, it is impressive. We punched far above our weight as a newly independent nation. And to think of how data was talked about in those years and the admiration in the writings of other leaders from newly independent countries is inspiring. To think that that is where we were and that those structures that were placed then still serve us so well, though they are modernizing and should be modernizing even better. I would say in the last 10 years or so, there's been an explosion of data coming from government in particular, to the point that we now both have too much data and too little. And I'll talk a little bit about why this might be the case. I am not someone who reflexively lays blame for everything on the current government or on any particular government. I like to examine what the facts warrant. And there have been failings of past governments when it comes to data, and I have laid those out in the book. But there are a couple of issues in which sort of historic breaks have happened in the last couple of years, and that needs to be said and acknowledged as well, and the book does do that. So these are not sort of blanket criticisms, they're very specific criticisms because there really have been these changes that need to be called out. I'd like to classify problems with data into 3 broad categories, and I'm sure Professor Subramanian will have more to say on this, especially on the last one, which I know is the big elephant in the room. I roughly split the issues into 3 categories, and this is very crude. Collection issues, sharing issues, interpretation issues, and then the question of whether there is manipulation or fudging. So just to get to the first one, which is collection issues, I'm just going to give you 2 quick examples from the book when it comes to collection issues. The first comes from my chapter on crime. One of the things that you'll again find as journalists is that statisticians in government offices are some of the most ignored and neglected people, and they're itching to find someone to talk to. So some of my best stories have actually come from talking to the statisticians in government offices. And this is what I found from one of them. India's only official source of statistics on crime is the National Crime Records Bureau, the NCRB. Yet most people know little about the NCRB's processes and methodology. For instance, the NCRB follows a system known as the principal offense rule. Instead of all of the IPC sections involved in an alleged crime making it to the statistics, the NCRB picks only the most heinous crime for each FIR for their statistics. I stumbled upon this then unknown fact in an off-the-record conversation with an NCRB statistics in the months after the deadly sexual assault of a physiotherapy student in Delhi in 2012. In the course of that conversation, I learned that the crime that shook the country would have only made it to the NCRB statistics as a murder and not as a sexual assault, because murder carries the maximum penalty. After I wrote this, there was pushback from the NCRB, but subsequently they've started carrying it in their disclaimers. So, I don't think that problems with collection form the bulk of Indian data, but this is an issue that comes up. And I'm just going to raise one sort of forward-looking issue about collection, which is when it comes to the census. Now, the census is sort of the holy cow of Indian data, which, the assumption is that just because of the sheer size of what it does, and the ambition of the enterprise, that it's beyond criticism. But I would like to say that I have pointed out in the book that there is some grounds for criticism. There is some data that the census misses. But I also want to make the point about what we need to worry about the future census. And this in particular is a point I'd like to make about the 2021 census that will begin soon, which is that the weaponization of the concept of citizenship that has happened over the last 2 years means that there is a violence in even asking questions around migration, around heritage, around family in the census. We are going to see that, and census and NSSO surveyors are already telling us that they are seeing this fear from the ground, which then means that the findings from the 2021 census are going to need to be interpreted with great caution, and to the point that some statisticians have almost cautioned that they might be unusably contaminated. So this is where collection issues sometimes come in. The second point I'd like to talk about is about data sharing, and this is an issue on which Professor Subramanian and I have run into the same issue of late, which is to do with excess mortality statistics. I'm just going to read a little bit about it. As all of you know, because India's COVID death toll is so woefully inadequate, many of us have turned to calculations of excess mortality. Professor Subramanian has worked on an academic paper on this as well. India last released all-cause mortality data for the year 2019. Yet I knew that updated data on deaths from all causes in the smallest village to the biggest city were being uploaded to the government servers every day. In June 2021, I began to access secret official government portals that held civil registration system data for every state. What I found, for example, was that in May 2021, the peak of India's second wave, mortality from all causes shot up to nearly 5 times the usual average in some states, as in Madhya Pradesh. So this is a case where the data existed but was not being shared, and I'm sure Professor Subramanian will have more thoughts on this. Finally, I just wanted to raise the issue about interpretations, and I think this is something that exercises developed states considerably. Because one of the issues with interstate comparisons is that I have come to the point that I find it impossible to say whether what we're actually doing is comparing states with a larger number of something with states with a lower number, or whether we're just comparing states that do a better job of reporting with others. This is a graph that looks at both experienced and reported sexual assault. And the quadrant that we usually focus on are the states who do in which women report the highest number of crimes to the police. But perhaps the quadrant we should be worrying about are the ones in which women experience a high number but report a very low number. And that's something that will not come out if you look at NCRB statistics alone. So I know that this issue of interpretation is also something that came up during COVID, because what happened after the first wave is that there was this mystery. Why were some states like Maharashtra, why had they had such bigger surges than other states like UP? How come there were such few deaths in UP? And I think the excess mortality reporting, as well as papers by Professor Subramanian, have shown that what was happening was lack of reporting and a severe undercount. So interpretation of interstate data in a situation where some states do a better job of reporting and some don't, lays a very uneven level field. And we need to think hard, journalists in particular, about how we're going to report on this going forward. This is the last question that I don't really have a good enough answer to, and happy to have a discussion around this. The number one question that I get asked by people is, can we trust statistics? Are they being fudged? Are they lies? Are they being manipulated? And I, as a journalist, like to go by things that I find evidence of. So we do have evidence that data in 2019 for unemployment was delayed and was released only after the government won re-election because it was unflattering data. We do have data that household consumption, we do have evidence that household consumption data, which again, painted a terrible picture of growth in the last 5 years, was suppressed and then for the first time in Indian history, not released at all. So we have that. But do we have evidence of data being manipulated? Well, there are questions from the GDP calculations, which Professor Rukmini knows much more about than me. But again, I'll sort of end with this, which is I feel very reassured despite the current landscape in the power of Indian journalism, because all of this that we know has come out through journalism. Not all of it, I mean, very little of it my own, the questions about the GDP calculation, about suppression of NSSO data have all come from, enterprising news reporters. So I'd say that my answer to this will be, I'll believe it as far as I can see evidence of it. I have not seen wholesale evidence of, mass manipulation of large surveys, but open to have more discussion about this, and very keen to hear Professor Subramanian's thoughts on this. Thank you.
May I invite Professor Subramanian to talk to us? And one of the issues which is disturbing us is the revision of the base year. And what is the impact of this revision of the base year? Was the base year revised only to get a better picture of the economy, or the base year was revised to have a better understanding? But this is a debate which is going on. Therefore, we would like Professor Subramanian to share his idea about the status of Indian data and where we are now. Over to you, Professor.
Can you all hear me? Yeah. First of all, let me say how honored I am to have been invited to this book event, not least because I think, as several people have noted already, this is an absolutely extraordinary book that Rukmini has published. It's kind of puts together, years and decades of such amazing, hardworking, insightful work on numbers and data, and I think without which, Indian democracy, Indian, the sphere of public reason would be so much more limited and inadequate if we didn't have such amazing work by journalists like Rukmini and, of course, many others. But this is a really extraordinary effort, and I'd like to congratulate Rukmini on this. Let me. I just want to say 2 or 3 things about the importance of data, and I want to give it instead of being a bit theoretical. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples to kind of make it kind of interesting for all of you. First of all, let me just say that I obsess with data like many economists should, and of course, maybe not as enough as journalists do. But let me just point out, the latest National Family Health Survey that's come out. I mean, one of the things I noticed was Tamil Nadu's sex ratio at birth now is actually much worse than Punjab's, and actually much worse than Punjab and Haryana were maybe 10 years ago. So when I look at a number like that, I think the number is something like 880 or 90 females per 1,000 males. And as you know, the normal number should be 1,005 females, broadly 1:1. And Tamil Nadu used to be at about 950, 960. And as you know, at least relatively speaking in India, that sex ratio at birth, Tamil Nadu is one of the better performers. And suddenly it's gone from 950, 960 to about 850, 860. And when I see a number like that, I'm completely puzzled, because on the one hand, I doubt, if it's true, then there's been a kind of almost an epidemic of female, selective sex abortion in the last 5 years. Do we have any independent evidence that that's happening? I don't know. On the other hand, it does certainly raise a question of whether, this data has been, this particular number, whether, one should have any great reliance on that. So even as we speak, the latest NFHS has kind of raised a number of doubts. But the broader point I want to make is the following, is that when you don't have, reliable data, it kind of crucially affects the diagnosis of the economy, and that in turn crucially affects the policy response. And let me just give you two examples when I used to work for government. I mean, the official numbers were painting a picture of the economy growing at 7.5%. And now we know that actually the economy was actually growing much slower than it was. And I look back and think that had we had more reliable data which better reflected the economy, there would have been two ways in which I think we'd have reacted very differently. One, there was the big debate, when I was in government about whether fiscal and monetary policy should be more supportive of the economy. And, I remember this very clearly because I was on the side of saying, yes, I actually think the economy is weaker than the numbers are suggesting. Therefore, fiscal policy should be more expansionary, monetary policy should be more expansionary. And I kind of lost that argument within government, partly because people would turn around and say, what are you talking about? We're growing at 7.5%. Why do you need more fiscal stimulus? You provide fiscal stimulus when the economy is in recession or when it's growing at, very weakly at 0.5%, 1%, 2%. But, you must be crazy to ask for fiscal expansion when the economy is growing at 7.5%. So I think that was really a very critical way in which, patchy data affected the policy response. The other thing, of course, similar thing, and in fact, I used to have this discussion with Mr. Jaitley a few months before he passed away, because as I had the paper I had written about the GDP, attracted a lot of criticism, and I came in personally for a lot of criticism, and I was discussing this with Mr. Jaitley, and I said, one of the unfortunate consequences was that, just the urgency for reform kind of was dented quite significantly because people thought the economy was not doing too badly. I remember, the urgency with which you will recall that, one of the early diagnoses that my team and I had of the economy was that there was a twin balance sheet challenge. The private sector balance sheets were very weak. Banking, assets were a lot of non-performing assets, and therefore I was very keen that we should take much more urgent and decisive action on those things. But then again, if the sense was that, the economy is not doing too badly, in fact, it's growing quite rapidly without addressing these problems, why address the problems? So I think that I have personally felt, the inadequacy of data and the unreliability of data, how it absolutely concretely affects, both diagnosis and then, of course, the policy response. I'm going to end with this, Rukmini spoke about excess mortality. In fact, I actually had first came to this thanks to, Rukmini's work and those of others who very bravely tried to, piece together data. And let me tell you one way in which, the excess, the underreporting of the deaths in India has had, I think, had a, I don't know how significant, but I certainly think it did have an impact. Because one of the things that I think the work by Rukmini and others has shown, certainly post facto, retroactively, that deaths in the first wave were actually much greater than we were led to believe, just looking at the official data. And you will all recall, and I have to be, honest in this, and as Rukmini says, we have to, assess our own assumptions and biases. When, if you recall, in January and February 2021, there was a sense in which India had, had a sense of complacency, had bred in India. And part of it was actually warranted by the data. To be fair to government and others who kept saying, oh, India has, escaped the worst of the first wave. There was a complacency, and it was actually partly fed by, the official data and the lack of actually better data on excess deaths. I think had we had better data, I think that complacency would have been lessened, and perhaps would have been much more on our guard before that, really brutal second wave hit the Indian economy. So in just so many ways, I think we need better data. I also want to end by endorsing something that Rukmini said at the end. I think we've kind of got into a general atmosphere where, things are so kind of fraught that, we always tend to talk in terms of, fudging and manipulation, et cetera, et cetera. And I think our first response always should be, does the data make sense? Can we cross-check it with other data? And I think before jumping to, glib and quick conclusions about, fudging, manipulation, etc. Look, I think governments all around the world are economical with the truth. It's not a particularly Indian phenomenon or, at this point in time phenomenon. It's always happened, always will happen. So the task for all of us, therefore, and that's why Rukmini's work and the book is so important, it is essentially, it is a kind of ongoing, kind of eternal battle between, governments that, mostly they don't, they produce good data. And even within India, even now today, for example, I'm able to say GDP data is maybe mismeasured only because I have other data from government which doesn't corroborate, other parts of what the government says. So it's not as if it's kind of uniformly bad or whatever. But I think, therefore, vigilance is the eternal price of democracy. Vigilance is the eternal price of good economic policy response, and therefore that good vigilance requires data from every possible source, especially from civil society, data journalists like Rukmini and so many others. And so I just want to end on a note of kind of gratitude for people like Rukmini and others who allow this, kind of in this ongoing battle between, a truth and half-truth, to give truth a chance. Actually, I'm reminded of a great saying by my colleague, and this applies to, I think, everywhere. He said, in Washington, the truth is just another special interest, and one that's not very well financed. I think we have to make sure that truth is not a special interest, and that it has much more general cachet and value, and anyone we can support who's providing that, especially journalists like Rukmini and others. I think we should support them, thank them, and keep them, and never leave them under-resourced, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. See, it's always said that if you torture data enough, it will concede to anything. And with this statement being said by a Nobel laureate, a lot of people want to know how to look at a data, whether it reveals something or it has been a tortured data. As a citizen, what are the tools we should deploy to understand the integrity of the data? Because data seems to be the realm of experts. And as a citizen, if you want to enter into the world of data, what are the cautions we should keep?
I mean, first of all, I just think we need a kind of a culture of openness and transparency Because remember, truth is not going to be the monopoly of any one person or any one group. So we just need an atmosphere where, the data is available. I mean, there's competition in terms of, lots of people working on this. And then, of course, people trying to communicate this. And, it's going to be an ongoing battle between, people who are doing this kind of work. So it's almost an ongoing process, which requires a broader climate of tolerance, a broader climate of openness and transparency, and just, a climate where lots of people are in this sphere, looking at data from different points of view, arguing with each other, debating with each other, and so on. So it's a battle that never ends. You just keep waging this all the time. I don't know whether Rukmini agrees with that or not.
No, I agree. I agree very much with what Professor Subramanian is saying. I would also add that as citizens, one of the best things we can do is understand how the data are constructed and what goes into the making of it. Because to know what parts of it have changed, or we should be rightfully suspicious of, or stand out, as with the example of the NFHS that Professor Subramanian gave us, you need to understand what goes into that data in the first place, the sort of making of the sausage, as you call it. So to know what data to access, even we need to know about it in peace times, which is why with excess mortality, for example, I feel that there wasn't enough regular conversation around birth and death registrations prior to the pandemic, and that has been exposed by how we have struggled to make sense of it. So calling on this data and expecting people to quickly understand it and become sort of overnight epidemiologists and modelers during a pandemic is clearly the bad way of going about it. Instead, if we had this sort of basic understanding of what goes into the making of data in peacetime, that would help us call on this much better. And this is somewhere that I feel that journalists have an important role to play as well, which is sometimes journalists talk about statistics in a way that they assume, actually journalists talk about a lot of things in a way that they assume all the readers are at the same place in their knowledge journey as them. And perhaps in the past, the explanation could be that there wasn't enough space. But now, because everyone has a digital edition as well, there is no good reason for this. Just as an example, when I started working at the Hindu, we reported on one of these opinion polls, and that was my first time reporting on a large opinion poll. And the Hindu had then, invested a lot in its website. So I got the opportunity to write a piece for print and then a big piece online in which we could explain the methodology of the poll. So if people have suspicions about opinion polling, it is incumbent on us to give enough information about the methodology of that poll to let people then draw their own conclusions. They might feel it's not a good enough poll and your findings are not good enough. So, it is incumbent on journalists to put out as much information as possible. And again, technology is playing an important role over here. Most journalists now have GitHubs where they put up all of the data that they're accessing. And this really should become regular practice. That if you believe that you have not tortured the data to confess that you have been fair to it, then you should put up all the raw data that you have used in public and let the people see if you have been biased in the way you've gone about it or if you've been accurate about it.
So Professor Panneerselvan, can I just say one thing? May I?
Please go ahead.
See, I think that the challenge in the modern era with social media, echo chambers, the rise of identity politics all around the world is, somewhere the sense that, citizens have, for whatever reason, have so made up their own minds that really it becomes, the openness to science, the scientific method, data methods, research, statistics, I think that is becoming more and more difficult. See, because by definition, citizens are going to be, by definition, less informed than others. So they will have to. I mean, they cannot independently come to a lot of judgments about some of these technical things. So there is going to be a process of these intermediaries, curators, as it were, of data, whether they are journalists, whether they're academics, or whether they're politicians, whatever. And so it's that that mediating layer of curators. They have this huge responsibility to deliver things. But the problem is, I don't think we should underestimate the problem we have today, where it's this old model of there is this truth out there, and all that needs to happen is to kind of uncover that and present it in accessible forms to a keen and enthusiastic but relatively uninformed citizens. I think that model, I think, is sort of breaking down. So that's why I think the challenge is much greater in these times. So just to give you an example, supposing I write, GDP is mismeasured, and if people have made up their minds about me, saying that I am X, Y, anti this, pro this, then the battle is lost. So it's that meta kind of level at which these things are going wrong is something also that we should be thinking about very, very hard and carefully.
This question is to Professor Subramanian as this, Rukmini as a journalist, and Professor Subramanian as a person who had been a policy advisor. See, in journalism, we have been trained to look at journalism as a profession which is traveling on two tracks. One track is to bear witness, another track is to make sense. Therefore, our analytical pages or our edit pages are supposed to help to make sense, and the reporting pages are supposed to bear witness, and one complements the other. But there was some sort of an interlocking public which was being worked into the idea of journalism. And this idea of interlocking public manifests itself in various forms. When we came up with poverty line, it was an integrated approach. It had calorific value, it had urban-rural value, it had gender cohesion. With an idea of integrated public or interlocking public has been embedded in these issues. What happens if it is going to be hyper-specialization, where you try to pull out just one strand to prove a point? And what happens with that? And how do journalists deal with it? And how do policymakers deal with it?
Go, please.
Would you like to go first, Professor Subramanian?
No, please, you go ahead, please. I'll follow, please.
Sure. So I suppose in a way, when we talk about cherry picking, that can be this as well, which is you take a large data set and you choose one particular thing that you want to talk about. And again, I will say, I'm not a pathologically both sidesism sort of person. There are things on which there aren't two sides. Everything doesn't have two sides, and I don't want to particularly engage in the views of people who are casteist or Islamophobic, or I don't have time for them. But I will say that there is cherry picking that happens in the interpretation of data by the left as well. And just to give you an example, one of the things that's got embedded in journalism is that choosing the bad news story is what's news. And I know that this consistently happens in data journalists' coverage of things like census or NSSO reports or even the NFHS, which is that improvements don't typically make news, and you are sort of encouraged either implicitly or very often in my career, very explicitly encouraged by editors to look for the big bad news story in it. And I suppose the conceit of journalism there is that you are holding, that this is speaking truth to power, you are holding the government accountable. But I think there has been a grave damage that has been done in some time periods of cherry picking the bad news story to the point that we reached a point that we believe, or I would say the average person perhaps believe, that the period between 2005 and 2015, for example, was one of a total absence of growth and development. You don't think of that period as one of the periods of historic reductions in poverty, because that was the cherry picking of data that was encouraged. So I feel like I'm going to repeat this point a lot, but I do think that a growing culture of putting the data out and allowing people greater access to it is important. And I agree with Professor Subramanian that this is not something that everybody will be able to access, and the role of curators is extremely important. However, there is at least some element of oversight that can happen, so that an informed or an engaged public can see if what's happening is cherry picking, or if they feel a sort of more accurate assessment of the situation is being given to them.
Professor Panneerselvan, your question was on hyper specialization, correct? When things become more and more technical, how do you kind of make sure that it doesn't get cherry picked, or people don't? I, in some ways, am actually maybe a little bit less worried about that, because for one thing, as long as the data is available, and as long as lots of people are working on this, you get this competition for unraveling the truth, as it were. So and of course, academics also have a important responsibility. They have their own professional norms of refereeing process, the debate, discussion, etc. So they also have that, and similarly, journalists have that as well. And in fact, I would say, in one respect, things actually seem to be improving quite a bit. I don't know how many of you have noticed that, until about I would say 20 years ago, the academics wrote the papers, the journalists did the journalism, and they were kind of two separate fields. But as much as journalists encroaching upon and trying to whatever, in fact, if anything, the other way happened first. Academics started writing, in very accessible forms and communicating to the public. I mean, for example, in the US, Paul Krugman, most famously, is known to be someone who writes very clearly and conveys these things to the public. So as long as lots of people were doing that, the fact of hyper specialization per se was not a problem. Because lots of people are doing it, they're doing the serious work, and they're communicating it, and there's a culture of discussion and debate, so that you arrive at something that everyone thinks is kind of plausible or reasonable. But I think both in academics, in society as a whole, in politics as a whole, some of those norms have started breaking down. And of course, with social media, you've got this extra layer of, what Rukmini said about journalism, of course, applies in spades to social media, where you get the, you get the polarization, and where again, the whole, if you think in journalism, bad news is news and good news is not news, I mean, that gets amplified in these echo chambers of social media. You go on Twitter, and someone is just out to say something really crazy to attract likes and tweets and so on. So that's why I think we're in an era where the more fundamental rules, as it were, of operation have changed quite consistently, and therefore, this is a long-winded way of saying, Professor Panneerselvan, that it's not hyper specialization per se. That's I think the real problem. It's kind of a deterioration of norms and kind of rules and behavior, and more broadly, that I think are making this moment in time so difficult to deal with?
I think we can open the floor for questions. If students have, yes, Professor Jayaranjan is the Vice Chairman of the State Planning Commission, and we have Professor Jayaranjan.
In fact, its question is for both of you, Panneer as well as to Rukmini. The kind of transformation that journalism has been experiencing of late, in terms of who controls the resources as far as journalism goes, and that much of the resources are being cornered by the carriers. If that is the case, now how data journalism will survive, and who will fund it? That is at one level. At another level, the last question that you asked, this hyper specialization, and for that, you need people like Rukmini who can bridge. She had studied, she knows how to read the data, and what these specialist kinds of people are talking about, and bring it to the common audience, so that people can read what's happening around. Is that possible now? Is it feasible? That model?
I don't know whether it's possible, but I know that uh, there is an in-house effort not to invest on domain expertise. For instance, after Ram Reddy's retirement, when he moved out of Hindu to edit EPW, India does not have a macroeconomic editor. Indian English journalism does not have a macroeconomic editor. We have some business editors, but we don't have macroeconomic editors. After Sainath's retirement, we don't have a rural affairs editor. But at some level, what is happening is that investment in domain expertise within media has come down drastically. And media tends to outsource these expertise. Therefore, we go to a former ambassador to get an opinion of the neighboring country. We go to a former banker to get an idea of what is happening with interest rates. We go to a former bureaucrat to get an idea on center-state relations. The idea is no longer investing on creating domain expertise in-house. But this is a big issue which is happening, and this is partly due to the financial stress to which media has been subjected to. But that's only a partial reason. But that's happening, and it's happening rapidly. So I don't know where we are heading, but I know that we are not heading in the right direction. That much I know very clearly.
If we looked around, we would feel that that this is the golden age for data journalism, because every newspaper, every publication has a data team, and some of them are even willing to invest in hiring engineers who are typically paid far more than journalists. But the same environment in which other journalism operates will come to pass for data journalists as well, which is the same pressures will come to operate for them as well. There are some positive signs. There are some media enterprises that have been able to start making the point that good journalism needs to be paid for, needs to be supported, whether it's a subscription model or a grant based model. We have not yet seen that transformation into sustainability in India, where a media organization, particularly one that's data focused, can say that our readers believe in this and are willing to support it with their money. We haven't yet seen that, but I would hope that if there's one of the good things that potentially that has come out for journalism in the last 2 years is that every newsroom has realized the value of both a health reporter and someone who can understand numbers. But yes, I would say just as data journalism operates under all of the conditions that the rest of journalism operates, the pressure that will apply for the future will be the same. And in fact, one of the sort of dangerous directions is that even newsrooms that may not invest in things like sending their reporters out to rural areas or having detailed reporting on caste, for example, they think of data as something exciting, shiny, being done by the FT, something we should invest in. So I suppose then it becomes incumbent on journalists who are being hired in these positions to remain true to beliefs of public interest and of what the core value of journalism should be. So much of the data journalism that we see in India and overseas is exciting to look at, and perhaps took a lot of work, but the public interest value in it is sometimes missing.
Partly the shift is bearing witness costs money, which means reporting costs money. And in that sense, data journalism seems to be an easy option of addressing the issue without really investing. Okay, there are definitely, it's a whole range of contradictions which is there. Earlier, the idea is once you bear witness and you make sense in your edit pages, there was certain amount of complementary understanding. Now you don't need to have this complementary understanding. For instance, if you look at your primetime debates on television, it's essentially opinion. Nobody reports on what happened there. There were views Trump news. When you use Trump news, and that also impacts data journalism. That's the reason one of the biggest problems we face now is comparison. If the categories have changed, how are you going to compare this data with another data? There are quite a lot of comparison of oranges and apples, which is happening right now. For instance, railways has been merged with, we don't have a separate railway budget any longer. There is no longer a planned expenditure. And if you are going to use the data now today, with say a data of 10 years earlier, this comparison, you need quite a lot of caveats and adjustments. And this adding these caveats and adjustment needs quite a lot of homework. It needs quite a lot of financial investment also on the part of the journalist, which means that journalist should be given at least 3 or 4 days to work on that story. But the journalist is expected to churn out something quickly. But it's not an encouraging reality right now.
Hello. My name is Suham. I'm an intelligence analyst. I work across data and also look at public policy. And my question is regarding data from a public policy view. We have seen that, recent governments, and you have said that there's an explosion in data recently in the last 10 years. We have seen that the government tends to avoid inconvenient data, as we see with NSO, unemployment, and whatever numbers are there. But there will come a time when it will release, where it will have to release those numbers at some point in time, and probably when that time approaches, the tendency or the incentive to, manipulate or, I won't go and say fudge, but the tendency to, release convenient numbers increases. So, I mean, my question is, I just want to use that, are we caught in a dangerous, vicious cycle of, pushing the data, releasing convenient numbers, and then going back? Because clearly the numbers are inconvenient to us, so we can't release them. So we tend to fudge the data. Is that a fear? And what is the future of this cycle?
So thank you for asking that, because I'm sure this is something that is top of mind for a lot of people who look at Indian data. And I would like to re-emphasize that, one of the reasons I talked about the, post-independence background of Indian data is that there exist mechanisms and oversight structures, which are the very reason we know what has happened. The reason we know what happened with the unemployment and the household consumption NSSO reports is because there was a National Statistical Commission which was, charged with this oversight, and members of it spoke out to the point of resigning about it because of what was going on. So I don't think that, sometimes we worry that these numbers exist on government servers with nobody there to look at and know oversight, and that's not the case. The reason we know what's happening is because there has been some oversight. Two further points from what you were saying. One is that you said that at some point they'll have to release this data. So what's particularly dangerous about the 2017 household consumption expenditure report, which should have come out in 2019, is that it wasn't released and it hasn't yet been released and it won't be released. And that hasn't happened before. And we, there are things that you think of, every generation thinks of things as, how could I have let this happen on my watch. As a data journalist, I feel it about this. How could we have let it happen that for the first time in India, an NSSO report whose contents I have in full and many other journalists have, because of the reporting of journalists, so may have business standard. But the government was able to argue that there was a problem with the methodology, which there clearly was not. There's enough evidence that there wasn't. It followed all of the mechanisms, but it came to pass that it wasn't released, and this is fact now. This has happened. So oversight mechanisms exist, but they are only as good as we empower them. And the fact that we allowed this to happen, that's where I then begin to worry about the future. What does this mean? What does this mean for future reports? Does this mean that they'll only be delayed? So many of those members resigned from the National Statistical Commission. So yeah, we should have talked a lot more about that report. We should not have let it happen. Every MP should have raised it. Maybe the people should have gone to court about it. And we should be paying more attention to oversight mechanisms. They exist. They have served us well. We need to be paying greater attention.
Just one point on that is that I think that we should also recognize that there are multiple oversight mechanisms. Some are within government, some journalists, some academics, the international community. So there are multiple oversight mechanisms, and I think we should. But I think we should also recognize that the effectiveness of these multiple oversight mechanisms is only as good as the general political environment is. I don't think we should, lose sight of that, because after all, one of the kind of real tragedies about this in India is that when people talk about the National Sample Survey and how it was created, in the 50s and 60s, we were the pioneers, not just for the developing world, but across the world. Angus Deaton, the Nobel Prize, always says the NSS sample survey was a model for how to do surveys for everyone, not just for developing countries. And over time we've kind of lost that, and not just under this government. I think it became, just as journalism is struggling with resources and what's a competing model, the funding of statistical agencies, the staffing, the resourcing, I think that has suffered over the years. And of course, now there's this extra layer of the whole, politicization of this. So I think multiple things are going on, and you have to work at this at several levels, as it were.
Any other questions? Okay. We'll ask Mr. Dilip D'Souza. Could you unmute yourself, please?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks, Rukmini, and thanks to Professor Subramanian for a most interesting discussion, and I look forward to reading the book. Rukmini, I was just listening to you talk about how it's incumbent on journalists to put the data out, and that's whatever on GitHub or wherever you suggest. And I think that's a very good idea, as is letting your readers and the public make up their own minds about it. But the question I have is, will they look at the data? And also, I don't mean to be supercilious as one who writes about some of the stuff myself, but can I ask, will people know how to interpret the data, and will they be informed about how to look at statistics? Because the knowledge about statistics and how to use it and how to look at it is anyway so thinly spread across public. So what's the guarantee that they will know how to understand it, and therefore what's the guarantee that they will be able to judge your reporting on the data? That's my question.
No, that's a great question. Thank you. And sometimes I think we use putting data out, putting the raw data out as sort of shorthand for transparency without doing the next step of making that data understandable. I think a lot of the problem lies in a sort of culture of fear around data that begins sometimes even from the school level. And there's a lot of work that needs to happen to help people feel, more confident about using that data. So yes, I think this is a long-term project that I don't have an immediate answer for. But the reason I continue to put faith and value in putting this data out in public is because for that, I treat it as the way I look at NFHS or NSSO data, which is thank you for giving me the summary tables in a PDF. Please also give me the raw data so that I know that what I'm seeing is accurate, that there's nothing that's going on that I'm missing. So I treat it as that sort of one additional layer of confidence building to people. And yes, I completely take on board the point that most people would not know what to make sense of it, which is why sort of partisan reporting remains a problem because people are not able to go to the raw data and look at it themselves. So they do rely on partisan reporting and all the attendant problems that go with it. I absolutely agree that this is not an immediate solution towards transparency.
So, can I ask? Can I follow up on that, please? Yeah. On this journalism thing, I mean, it's something There's in India. There's this kind of additional dimension, right? When the question was asked, is the journalism model, is it working? Do we need resources, etc.? And also the question about putting out data, the role of journalists, etc., etc. I mean, I wonder how much in India, we have this problem with the English-speaking journalism, and then there's the whole different level of all these issues in the vernacular in journalism, right? I mean, if we think that the English-speaking reader, I'm not saying this is true, and by no means am I implying this, but generally, if we think that the quality both of journalism, because the resources are greater for English language journalism, how do we deal with this, in the vernacular? Because on the other hand, if you, Rukmini, if you remember this whole excess mortality thing, it's the vernacular press in Gujarat, in UP MP that actually brought this all to our attention in terms of how morbid and gruesome these things were. But leaving that aside, they're closer to the ground and things. I think in India, the wedge between English language journalism and vernacular journalism, I think not enough attention I think is given to vernacular journalism. But I may be wrong, so I'd love to hear your views on that.
No, I absolutely agree with what you're saying, and in fact, for this very reason and on excess mortality, the first article that I wrote, which was from Madhya Pradesh, I chose to write it for Dainik Bhaskar in Hindi because in the past they had engaged with me with a desire to have some data journalism, though as Professor Subramanian says, the budgets are much more constrained. But I felt that the impact that it would have in Dainik Bhaskar was incomparable with elsewhere. Some of us data journalists have been doing training programs for non-English newsrooms. We did one in Malayalam recently, and this is something that more data journalists, especially ones who are able to access sort of grants and fellowships, would be happy to do for more non-English journalism as well. And the point that you made about all of the COVID reporting that was happening in the Gujarati press, for example, essentially that was data journalism without the trappings or the fancy descriptions. So perhaps more sort of knowledge sharing of resources between those in the English and non-English media. It's already happening because many of us feel very mission-like about data journalism, and the more people we can train, the happier we feel about it. So hopefully it is happening.
Dharni, please. Mute Dharni.
Hello, yes, sorry. I had problem unmuting. Good evening, Paneer. How are you doing? So yeah, my question is this. Rukmini said that data journalism is improving and every journalist house now has a data unit. But the problem is, we all know, journalistic houses across the world are starved of funds, right? Like, most of the leading journalist houses are now being acquired by successful political parties or by really successful corporate houses, from Italy to US to India. And even in the Hindu, the reader's editor's post after your retirement is still unfulfilled. So how do you think that journalist houses will be able to hire and maintain a really strong data team, given they're starved of funds?
No, it's certainly difficult, and I think we're beginning to see some innovation around this in India. I think there have been experiments with paywalls and paid for models. There's experiments with subscription models. I think maybe the next year or so will show us what readers want. Do they want to read this, but they don't want to pay for it? In which case, we need to continue looking at grants, many of them from overseas. Are readers demonstrating that they will pay for this, because some are experimenting with this. Yes, I mean, I think this is a crisis across Indian journalism, but there is a lot of innovation that's going on, and maybe in the next year or so, we'll see if people pay for good journalism. That's my main message to anyone. If you follow a news portal that's doing good work and they put out their appeals for subscriptions, if you have been reading it and you do support them, and you feel like corporate media is not representing what you believe is public interest journalism, pay for it. We need to pay for journalism.
What we have to keep in mind is the most highly subsidized product in the country is the English language media. English language journalists who fight against subsidy for poor are the people who actually produce a more highly subsidized product. For instance, I can talk about two publications about which I know very well. One is called the Hindu Business Line, another one is called Business Standard. Both of them were priced at 3 rupees when they launched in 1994 in the new avatar. And today their price is 5 rupees. If you add purely inflationary adjustment, Business Line or Business Standard should be about 25 rupees. If the economic papers which are talking against subsidy are so heavily subsidized, then we have to look at the political economy of information. And the moment we understand the political economy of information is so skewed, and we are not able to address this, that the question of sustainability is no longer there. People only with deep pockets want to get in, and they don't want media to be a sustainable entity. Therefore, the loss has been seen as a future investment. Therefore, the terminologies have been changed. Our idea is not to keep it sustainable. Idea is to support people with deeper pockets. But it's a different political economy which is governing our information ecology. And we are not going to understand the impact of the corporate ownership. Then we are going to be in a much bigger trouble. Yes, sir.
I think, Paneerselvan, what you're saying is a very good point, but it's happening globally. By the way, this is not an Indian phenomenon. Every place in the world where you take the United States, for example. You take Fox News, you take Wall Street Journal, etc. A radical thought would be that just as we think maybe public funding of elections is the way forward to avoid corporate money on elections, maybe there is a future model in which public funding of journalism is kind of what we should all be thinking if we worry about corporate takeover of journalism.
Our fear is, in the case of India, when BG Varghese committee came up with the idea of public broadcasting, and when Prasar Bharati was created, instead of creating a public broadcasting, we created a state broadcasting.
Yeah.
And this distinction between state broadcasting and public broadcasting was never established. And the people from the Indian Information Service never wanted to be part of an independent corporation. Therefore, it was not a CBC or it was not a BBC, but it was an extension of the state. But that is another issue. Are we going to create an institutional mechanism where it becomes another state institution rather than an independent institution? How to ensure independence of these institutions? It's a much larger question. And there are two major reports. One is the second Press Commission report, and third is BG Varghese report. And BG Varghese report, when it was implemented by the National Front government in '89, it got its structural arrangement only under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao in 1993. We took nearly 4 years, and after 4 years when it was implemented, none of the key values of BG Varghese committee was there. Instead of being an independent media, in public media, it had become a state media. That's another issue. But though we think that there should be a public investment, we don't have a clear-cut idea of how to see that public investment remains a public investment and it doesn't become a state propaganda. I don't know how to address this, but barring the Canadian example, I think even BBC is under severe strain now. If you look at the license fee negotiations which is going on, only the Canadian seems to have cracked it far better than anybody else. But that's a much larger question which all of us have to grapple together.
Next question from Mr. Murli, sir.
Mr. Murli, you can unmute yourself.
Yep. I hope everyone can hear me. I mean, just there are first an observation and then a quick question. I think the term, the data journalism that Rukmini and Professor Subramanian and yourself as well keep mentioning that it's been a very common populist phenomenon in the last 15 years or so, and it's been in vogue. It's kind of actually synonymous to the rise of digital technology. For someone like Professor Subramanian, data sets actually largely about some of these digital sets that requires lots of capacity building, academic expertise, able to look at data in a particular sense. But at the moment, the data journalism actually is kind of responding to supply-driven digital technology-oriented data. So that kind of goes back to some of the questions people raise, that what does it take to be actually, get the one that we want, demanding the data, the right data. I say this because my specific question is about public actors, public agencies, international agencies, or tech corporations that are not necessarily embedded or committed to public values in today's data-enabled, tech-enabled datafied society. And we already know in the West that it has started affecting citizens' access to health, public health, insurance, access to market, banking, and other related services. So how's this actually, I would like to ask this question to authors and Professor Subramanian. Do you have any insights about how this phenomenon is actually panning out in India? Is the state already equipped enough to put any regulatory reforms in India? And how will corporate datafication change our understanding of public data in future? Thank you.
If I understood correctly, it was about how access to data from private companies, including large tech corporations, could change our understanding. I'm sorry if I haven't understood it correctly. So one of the things that some of the people who read my book comment is my heavy reliance on government data. And that comes from a number of places, one of which is that government data tends to be far more representative than privately sampled data. But the question also is of access. And I would have loved to be able to use a Facebook data set, for example, for this, but you do not get ungated access to even anonymized data. And so it's actually, we feel that we have a right to government data, and we do. It is our own, and this is, I mean, we make up this data. But given the amount of our personal data that private tech corporations now own, the lack of journalistic oversight and access to this data is a real problem. It hampers our ability to say things about the new economy, and it also it raises questions of ownership of that data. Certainly, I think people do tend to look at some of these insights from data stored by tech corporations in areas for which government data is not available. I'm personally, I haven't yet had good enough access to feel entitled to say big things about the country yet from this. And also, there's a broader point that I want to make, which is that the more we look at alternatives to government data, my concern, and the Indian tech community is very good at this. For example, if you look at COVID-19india.org, which is something that came up because the government was not putting out its own data in a collated and accessible form. The Indian tech community is very public spirited, has great abilities, regularly puts these important resources out for free. But I worry about its impact on democracy, because our sort of push to the government, maybe, all of the MPs would have been standing up in parliament and saying, why don't we have a government website for COVID data? If private individuals had not come in to offer this data themselves. So I do worry about, I suspect I haven't answered the question as the person was asking, but I do worry about this trade-off, that the more we rely on alternative private sources, the sort of, we lower the volume of democratic pressure on the government to deliver on data that it should be rightfully giving us.
So on that, I completely agree with what you just said, that it's kind of creates this, if you exit from the public system, the pressure on the public system to deliver goes down. It's a more general problem. But in the short run, if government data is going to be problematic, and, just so that we understand better what's happening, in various spheres, including the economy, I think we're kind of in a kind of second or third best situation where actually having this private data is on balance helpful, rather than, keeping in mind completely your long-term concern here. So just to give you one example, for example, Raj Chetty, who's a professor at Harvard, he was producing real-time macro analysis of the US economy almost on a daily basis. It's almost like they could produce daily GDP, employment, inequality, all these numbers by piecing together a lot of private data. Of course, the problem is that only he has access to it. So by definition, it becomes very kind of exclusive and kind of discriminatory, as it were, and unequal. So my own view is that these sources, private sources, can be valuable, can help us supplement this. So I think we should be relying, especially outsiders, people who are outside government, journalists, academics, etc., should get access, but always mindful of the fact that it is no substitute for government data and public data, and that we should always keep up the pressure to get good official data. But so it's kind of like in a second and third best situation. What do you do?
Sorry, if I could just quickly add one thing, which is that I agree, and I feel like we saw this in the pandemic, and we're going to see this more for the economy and unemployment, that large-scale private surveys to which currently limited people have access might become more widely available, and that's exciting. It's high-frequency data, we could say a lot more. But one thing that worries me in a couple of instances recently is that the same sort of prickliness that the government sometimes demonstrates when its data is questioned or its sampling or its methodology is questioned is sometimes demonstrated by private surveyors as well.
Absolutely.
So if they want to enter this field and be seen as an alternative to government data, they are going to also have to take on board criticism, whether of their sampling, of their methodology, open it up a little more than they're currently doing, because there's a great deal of prickliness that comes from private surveyors at the moment.
Yeah, I agree.
One thing which is troubling some of the people who have been working on numbers is that numbers do not have a adequate qualitative backing to it. Since it doesn't have adequate qualitative backing to it, sometimes it might become an instrument for perpetuating the inequality. The way it can actually multiply the present inequality because the numbers are going to draw from the present, and the present might has been embedded in a much more unequal society. How do we deal with this aspect? How are we going to use the number to make it much more egalitarian? How to deal with an inbuilt bias in the numbers of towards people who are privileged versus people who are not that privileged?
Can I throw this to you first, Professor Subramanian?
Uh,
Well, I slowly think about it.
Yeah, no, see, it's a great question, and you know, I think the very glib but honest answer is that, you know, we should be investing much more in our basic education, the quality and quantity of, you know, basic education, so that we get you know, a society that is, you know, capable of, at least has the ability in principle to make these judgments. So in that sense, you know, the failure of primary education and you know, the both quality, quantity, and everything, that's been a huge development failure in India, and I think that has to be, you know, the most fundamental line of defense against this. And then the other thing I would say, repeating myself, Professor Panneerselvan, is that, you know, by definition, this is, you know, numbers and data are going to be, you know, asymmetric in their access. You know, some people will have a greater proficiency. So I think we need to do all that to, you know, reduce this inequality. And one way to do that would be to, you know, fund journalism more, provide more resources, and have an atmosphere where, you know, there's always, you know, a constant debate and discussion about these things. So, you know, that's the only way you can, you know, make these things. Otherwise, you tend to keep it like the preserve of some community or some special group of people. And then, of course, then the battle is lost and you will make it very unequal, the access.
Sure. No more questions? Should I? Okay. Sure. Okay. I'll actually take your question forward and use that to end, which is that one of the chapters looks at people's thoughts and beliefs, and you know, one of the consistent finding from opinion polls and surveys is that you know, the vast majority of Indians have far more socially conservative beliefs than we would like to commonly believe. There's far more support of casteist beliefs. There is widespread opposition to intercaste and interreligious marriage. And I think a lot of Indian liberals choose to think that this is a fringe. And the numbers showed me that it very much isn't. This is the most, the prevalent thought. And I would say that even while writing about it, I did consider this very point, which is that by putting it in this way, are you reinforcing these very norms? Will people read it and find comfort that their casteist beliefs, they are not alone in their casteist beliefs? Is that what they'll take away from this? So I don't have an answer to it, and I do feel that I've done it in good faith. And I also would like to acknowledge that numbers only go so far. and the norm setting and norm changing that needs to happen around something like intercaste marriage. Because if you think of what Ambedkar said 85 years ago about intercaste marriage being the solvent of caste, and the fact that a majority of Indians say that intercaste marriage should be stopped, a majority across caste groups and religious groups, it seems very clear to me that the norm setting that should probably be led by politics is what's not happened. So I don't have an answer to whether data is reinforcing these inequalities, or if it is doing what I hope it is, which is sort of pushing an atmosphere of inquiry forward, forcing us to confront our own biases. And sometimes and particularly the chapter on beliefs made me think about the fact that echo chambers operate in this way as well. Even wanting to see the goodness in the majority of your country can sometimes be an echo chamber, and knowing what the data shows on what the majority of Indians think is also a pretty sobering experience. Just as it is a sobering experience to think of how much a majority of Indians live on, spend on. All of these are ways to potentially break out of our own sort of comforting bubbles.
Professor, we would also like to know what is the importance of context in understanding data. How important is the idea of context to locate data?
Absolutely. I think context, is hugely important, because, as you yourself said, understanding is shaped by, some, evidence. It could be quantitative, qualitative, but against a broader background of what are the values, what is the culture, what is the people's beliefs about these things, and it's that coming together of this evidence and all these prior notions about what you call context, I think is and there, frankly, that's kind of a much bigger problem. It's about norms, values, who takes the lead, and what Rukmini just said. And I guess really the only solution is that the argumentative Indian that Professor Sen goes with, that basic feature trait of India we should not lose, and and the culture should not allow us to lose that, because if we lose that, then even the context, first, the evidence becomes kind of compromised, and then when the context goes, then you're basically nothing. You're left with very little then to make these judgments.
Let me use this occasion and move out of context. We are very, very happy with your piece on Keshav Desi Raju's book for India Forum. Thank you. And let me use this opportunity to move out of the context.
Sorry, what was that?
Keshav Desi Raju's book on MS Subbulakshmi.
So sorry, you like the review? Okay. In fact, I have to say, you're such a wonderful person that I just felt blessed that I was able to, write the review, and that he was able to read the review, because maybe just before a month before he passed away, he actually wrote to me, and so I just feel blessed that I had the opportunity to do that. And of course, I should thank, by the way, this is also a shout out to people like, what was the Hindus' loss and then became EPW's loss is the India Forum's gain. Ram Reddy has kind of, created another very nice. So just to end on this slightly optimistic note, you are getting creativity as well in this space, so while we bemoan, all that's happening, there's also a lot of churn and creativity in India. I mean, the India Forum is a great example of that, where you're getting this, rigorous, somewhere in between short and long form kind of journalism. So I don't think we should give up hope. I think, a lot of creativity, a lot of terrific people with energy, bravery, enthusiasm. And I think we should be, on balance, hopeful despite the very challenging broader environment.
Thank you. Let's end on that hopeful note, and I would like my colleague Sundar to deliver. Sorry, we are running out of time here.
So my question is to Professor Subramanian, and that how does a delay in data collection affect policy making, specifically focusing on the census 2021, which was delayed due to COVID, and the process hasn't started yet. So that's my question.
I think we're running out of time, right?
I'm sure there will be more questions. I'd like to thank the author, Rukmini, for writing this wonderful book and also agreeing to join us for this discussion. I'd like to thank Professor Arvind Subramanian, joining us from all the way from US. Thank you, sir, and all of you. And of course, Mr. A.S. Panneerselvan for moderating this wonderful discussion. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. And we'll let you know about the next program very soon. And on behalf of the Roja Muthaiah Research Library and the Dravidian Professional Forum, I'd like to thank all of you. Have a great evening.
See, all the participants here, the book is available outside and there is a discount of 15%. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.